Okay, today we go a little more in depth to generational stereotypes and a larger question of how much of you should you adjust in the workplace to quote unquote fit in. The two words we're focusing in on today are generational stereotyping, which is the assigning of characteristics to different generations, often showing itself in negative characteristics of the younger generations, and code switching, adjusting one's style of speech, appearance, behavior, and expression in ways that will optimize someone fitting in. Often the term is used relating to minority-majority interactions in a country. So let's talk a little bit about generational stereotypes. From all my research and from everything that I've read, this is a common and multi-generational thing that happens throughout the course of human history. It is just repeated over and over and over. And that is older people look at younger people and say, well, it was better in my day. These young people today, they weren't as fill in all the good characteristics. Dedicated. They didn't know the value of $1. They didn't work as hard as we did. We had it harder. They have it easy. They're not serious. We were more respectful to our parents. This has been going on, and there's uncredited sources that you can go back to ancient Egypt and see writings about one generation to the next. Ancient Greeks would say the same thing. You want to spend a lot of time researching it, you can find it in books going to the Middle Ages, you can find it in more modern books, you can find it in newspapers, and quite frankly, I don't have to do that because I've lived long enough to experience it through 2, maybe 3 generations. So I've just lived it and seen people do it, and it's a real thing. So I've come up with some thoughts of why this tends to happen. These aren't research. These are just my thoughts on it. Feel free to come up with other thoughts of why this might happen generation after generation after generation, and feel free to disagree. Number one, there's probably a little truth in it. Older people are, in general, literally wiser than young people. Older people went through all the mistakes younger people are going through. And, the older people look at younger people and it's just like, oh, why can't you grow up? I grew up. And they forget that growing up is a process and everyone has to go through the process. And they went through the process. But still, even though older people, not we, even though we know everyone has to go through it, it's still so forever taking, and you just want the younger generation to, come on, reach maturity, when really it's a slow process. So it is really kind of insufferable, and it creates a lot of frustration when you're looking at the next generation, like, just get it. And then 15 years later, they get it. So there's a little bit of that going on, the natural growing up, maturing process, and it's tough to wait for a whole generation of people to do that. Here's one. Older people's memory is very selective. I found this growing up. It's very, very easy to look at the past 20 years ago and forget about all like the awkward bad things you did and pretend things were better than they were, that you were more effective than you were, that you had better relations and interactions with people than it was. It's very easy to remember your earlier life and sort of think that you were doing it with the knowledge you have now, okay? So it really is true that, yes, we were all very immature growing up and we didn't handle situations well, okay? And just like everyone growing up, and things were, all over the place sometimes. It's too easy to gloss over the negatives of your own past lives and exaggerate how good you were at something or the positives. For example, the younger generation complains about something and the older generation is like, well, we didn't have that. We didn't complain about it. We just sucked it up. No, they didn't. They're forgetting all the time that when they were young, they were complaining about things too. Okay, so they're forgetting that they went through the same cycle. And also, the new generation represents change. Okay, and also the new generation represents a clear reminder that people are getting older. So maybe that should be a number 4. So having the next generation is a stark, clear, painful reminder that time keeps moving on. And there's a younger generation that has 15 to 20 more years of life that gets to experience all those fun things about growing up and being youthful and being in the 20s and the 30s. And it's a reminder that the older generation is 20 years closer to the end, whatever the end may be. And that's very painful for people. So there is that going on in the brain, and sometimes that comes out in frustration. The new generation, number 3, which is up there, represents change, and change is uncomfortable, okay? There is the idea in sociology that people don't like change, they like what's comfortable. So as the new generation comes in and does things in a different way, that experience brand new technology, that doesn't value the old ways of doing things, the world is changing, and it's becoming less comfortable to the people who liked it the way it was. And we could put in number 5. The old generations eventually have to give up power, or they know they're going to give up power, so maybe they're a little resentful of that. Although that one, I don't think that one's as good and well thought out, so scratch the power one. And as I talk it through, it feels like there's more things in my head that could come together in a puzzle of all these little reasons where the generations feel divided. And when two groups feel divided, and this is a truth of history too, when two groups feel not united but divided, even divided by age and experience, okay, what one group grew up with cartoons and stuff like that is totally different from the other. The experience divides the group, age and experience. When two groups are divided, the possibility of a negative relationship instead of a uniting relationship enters in. And you see that in world politics, in countries, and it's just throughout all history. The division of groups, unless you try really hard in conflicts, or I don't want to say hatred because there's no hatred between the generations, but stereotypes and negative thoughts. Okay, so we have the divide of generations, so it almost is the human condition that when two groups are divided, negative thoughts come to the forefront instead of the positive. So that's also what we can do, by the way, to fix generational stereotypes, is let's start having people of the different generations focus on what brings them together more than what's dividing them. And then all of a sudden, when you go from two groups that might even be different, but when they start focusing on being together, you get rid of a lot of these negative aspects, and people focus on the unity and the positive. So regardless of the reason, generational stereotyping has been going on for generations. Let's talk a little bit about it. Typically, it is not legally protected. So if you're in the workplace and people start complaining about the younger generations, that is not necessarily illegal harassment. Okay. So it can come up in business decisions, often to whom to put onto jobs and such like that. It's a very few states that actually protect younger age from discrimination. It's going to be tough to get a illegal harassment case for it. So that's why we're including it in the non-illegal types of harassment. Typically, it's not very protected. It's not new. Previous generations have done it. Stereotypes of generations sometimes get kinder as they get older. I remember that my generation, they railed against us with some of the most unkind things you could ever say about a human as Generation X. I mean, literally cutting to what it means to be a good person. And they just said we didn't have it. But what's one of the most respected generations right now? Generation X. So all of a sudden, given an extra 20 years, the rest of the world is like, hey, wait, those qualities that we made fun of you for, those qualities that thought you would burn the country down metaphorically, well, they're actually really good qualities when you got to get out into the workplace, and you did okay, Generation X. Now, sometimes the generations, it can go the other way. We're seeing a lot of negative stereotypes against the older generation, the baby boomers right now. They're the oldest generation that's living right now. And so we're seeing a pretty big backlash on them in a negative stereotype. By the way, they are protected legally because they're over 40. So be careful of stereotyping over 40 people. Now, some stereotypes are statistically true. I'm sure if you did enough studies, you could find that some of the stereotypes of the generations bear out 51% of the time, and they might be statistical majority, but that doesn't mean it's a good thing to do, and it doesn't mean it's a good way to live your life. We talked about it earlier, because you're not really getting a good picture of reality when you ignore people's individually. Some stereotypes are not the statistical majority, okay? So sometimes only a few people in a generation, a small percentage, do something, and then everyone stereotypes it and blows it out of proportion. These are even more infuriating to the people on the receiving end of it. Typically, always, the positives of a generation are typically downplayed and the negatives are typically played up. If we went through each and every subsequent generation of Americans, every single younger generation since the beginning of America in 1776 has had great qualities that they bring to this country, unique, great qualities, but no one ever praises them while they're growing up for those qualities, okay? They're always typically playing up the negatives. And once again, we get a quote. It's not that a stereotype, this is a paraphrase. It's not that a stereotype might be wrong. It's that it prevents someone from telling their own story. And this is a fantastic TED Talk. Perhaps I'll link it. I cannot think of the person's name, but it is The Danger of a Single Story. It's millions of views, okay? So some of you probably already heard it. And so getting into my advice for generational stereotypes. So what are you going to do? They're probably legal. You're going to face them. All right. So if you know you're going to face something and you don't have any legal recourse, so maybe knowledge is power, right? So first off, know all the negative stereotypes for the generations before you and your generation, okay? Because oftentimes you are linked in to the generation before you, whether you are or not, okay? So you're really trying to figure out right now, that would be, if you're younger listening to me, that'd be all the negative stereotypes for millennials and all the negative stereotypes for Generation Z. And then, because the negative stereotypes are usually really bad workplace characteristics, don't do them. Know them and never do them. Because number one, you shouldn't be doing negative things anyway at your work and showing negative qualities. And number two, especially you don't want to show the negative qualities of generational stereotypes at your workplace. And find the positives for your generation. Find what your generation is better than anyone else at and take pride in it, because you are going to move the country further. Those one or two things that your generation is better at are the things that are going to change society. So know what the positives are of your generation and embrace them. This is a technique when we're talking about those legal stereotypes. It uses the other people's stereotypes to your advantage. It uses their own minds to your advantage. See, if you break their negative stereotypes so hard, if you are nothing like a millennial, if you are nothing like the negatives of a Generation Z when you go out to the workplace, it is impossible for them to ignore your own individuality. And then you become an individual and they're forced to see you as an individual. And that's when you really shine through. So by breaking every and not doing any of the negative generational stereotypes, you stand out and you become an individual. And that's how you become something special in the workplace. Opens up so many doors. So stereotypes and the fact that whether they're legal or illegal in the workplace bring up a fairly major question. Since we spend so much time in the workplace, should you adapt yourself to the culture of your workplace to quote unquote fit in? Should there be a real you and then a workplace you? For example, the vocab word code switching, adjusting one's style of speech, appearance, behavior, expression in ways that will optimize fitting in. There's a couple different angles to look at this from, because the answer is not necessarily so simple. So in answering it, let's set some ground rules. So the first ground rule is that protected characteristics and classes are legally protected, okay? And it's generally agreed that the workplace should not pressure you to change based on your protected classes. So if you're ever in the workplace and there's pressure to be less like a stereotypical insert protected class, even if that happens in the workplace, it's generally assumed that that is not a good thing and it's not where the workplace should be going. These protected classes are protected legally and no one should be asking you to be less like your protected class. So that's first ground rule. Second angle to look into this is that many people of protected classes, and we are all protected classes because they encompass everybody. It just matters whether your protected class is the majority or the minority at a workplace. Certain individuals self-choose to downplay their own characteristics of protected classes. And there are literal studies and a couple studies and many questions on whether this is a good thing or bad thing. I will leave it to you to think about, while just saying my opinion is that in my perfect world, nobody should feel the pressure to code switch or downplay an aspect of their protected class to feel like they're fitting in or to get ahead. I want to work for a workplace where that does not enter into someone's mind that they should need to or have to or will get an advantage if they do code switch. And then we get to the angle of, what if the characteristics aren't protected legally? Is there an argument for fitting into a workplace culture? And this argument, I think, is very, very much open to debate. And this could be like the professionalism of how you dress. What subjects are typically talked about at your workplace? If you're in a highly intellectual workplace, but your whole family are sports nuts, are you going to code switch and take that part of your life, your love of sports, and maybe you were a great sports person growing up, and now are you going to downplay that and not bring it up as much because your workplace is focused mostly on intellectual conversations instead of the physical conversations? And your use of a language that's not related to a protected class. If you happen to have a local accent from one of the places around the United States and you get to a professional setting where no one uses that local accent, are you going to downplay your local accent or not? They're not illegal classes. They're not protected classes. They're just differences in from maybe where you grew up in the United States or what your family does, and it's not based on a protected class. And are you going to code switch? Maybe you like facial jewelry or piercings, yet maybe people at your a professional workplace, it's just, I'm not saying frowned upon, but no one does it. It's not part of the culture. Okay, there's no rules against it, but are you going to code switch and downplay your own sense of piercing styles or cover up a tattoo? Not that you have to because there wouldn't be a rule, but because you're like, well, I'm just going to downplay the fact that I have a tattoo because it seems to fit in better with what we're doing. These would be code switchings. Should you? I don't know. This is an individual choice, right? If it's not a big deal, or if it's really a small part of you and you know it's just going to make you feel more comfortable, then maybe do it. Like if you want to go and buy different, types of clothes that other people seem to be wearing, it might not be you. Try it out. It's not a big deal. You literally don't care what you wear. That's fine. If you say pop instead of soda, and now you're working in New York, certain parts of New York, and people are saying soda, well, maybe just change the way the names of pop to soda. Okay, maybe it's something that you just don't care about, but now you know that you're at work not around your family, so just change the words you use. If it's not a big part of you, maybe you decide to do it. Oh, but maybe you want to be more true to yourself. Maybe it is a big part of you. Maybe your tattoos mean something, and maybe your body piercings really pierce down into your soul in some way. And maybe at that point you're like, no, I want to express my individuality. Because, you're being true to yourself. I will tell you this. The more you have to code switch away something that's really you, that you really identify with, the more you have to code switch away, there's some psychological things. A couple studies have shown there's some psychological things, and it does hurt you a little in the brain. And maybe there's something to having diverse modes of speech, diverse modes of body adornment, tattoos and piercings. Maybe it's something worthwhile to bring to the workplace. So not code switching and saying, man, this is me. It doesn't impact my performance. I'm just going to be me. Maybe that's going to bring something good to your workplace too. This is a toughie. So to summarize, to be very clear, personal opinion, I want to work towards a world where we don't have to code switch anything related to our protected classes. And If it's not related to a protected class, then you got some things to debate in your own life, whether you want to join in with what everyone else is doing at the workplace or whether you want to express yourself. It's a big question, and you'll figure it out when you get there. All right, thanks for watching.